Really, I think people can't understand why someone with an addiction is destroying themselves and those around them, destroying their careers, destroying their education. My name is Andrew Da Roza. I am an addiction psychotherapist. I'm working for Visions, which is the addictions recovery arm of Promises Healthcare. There are a great many common misconceptions about addiction. Most people will see someone with an addiction as being someone to be alarmed about. They might be quite frightened, they might be quite anxious, they might be quite annoyed or frustrated. They think, well, surely this person must understand their suffering, and I can see their suffering. And sometimes they would admit that they're suffering. Someone who does not have an addiction would automatically think, well, why doesn't that person just say no to drugs or to gaming or gambling? And someone who is looking at someone with an addiction might say they seem very rational. I mean, in other parts of their lives, they seem quite rational. And they might even observe that this person with an addiction is admitting they have a problem, admitting that they want to do something about it, but then they just don't seem to be able to control their behavior. There is in addictions then this sense of powerlessness over the behavior. And in addition to that, that there is this unmanageability that someone with an addiction would have in their lives. There would be a chaos in their lives, and there would be a great deal of hurt and pain, not just for them, but for those around them. A person with an addiction will have tried to stop many times and not succeeded. They may, of course, in one moment convince themselves that they must do something about it, and they must do something different. But then in the next moment, they might think, well, this is not so bad. Others are worse, that they can do something about it tomorrow, or that they can just try harder, even though they've been trying as hard as they possibly can. So there is a great deal of shame that comes with this behavior, and the people with addictions do very keenly feel that they've let people down, and their loved ones may have pleaded with them, may have begged them, may have shouted at them, may have even abused them, but none of this works. So that really is the essence of addiction. Yes, I think really the essence of addiction is that it starts relatively early on. Indeed, by the time someone has created enough suffering for themselves and others, and they come into the clinic, they may have been suffering for many years. It is still possible. The recovery process, in fact, assumes that someone has been doing this for quite a long time, and assumes that they're struggling with even starting the addictions process. Because to start the addictions process, I have to admit to myself, not just to others, that I have a problem, and that I can't manage it on my own, and that others can help me. And that's very tough for some people to do. It may take them a long time to get to that place, and they may have to suffer a great deal and lose a great deal before they're willing to come to that place. So quite often, it does take quite a long time to get into therapy. Assessing a client is done using very good and very detailed written questionnaires that we have. The first thing we do is look for the pattern in the behavior that's causing so much distress. When they started, the frequency, the types of behavior, and how risky and how damaging that behavior is. We ask the client whether the client has actually talked about this behavior before. Perhaps whether the client has been lying about it or denying it or covering it up. We seek to really understand how much distress that they are in and how much distress their loved ones are in. It's very common that there's rage, shame, anxiety, depression, even suicidality and self-harm, and so we will ask questions that try and reveal those things. We ask how the behavior has affected their relationships and their health, their job, and their studies. Have they given up friends? Have they given up interests? We ask whether their friends are people who also suffer the same behavior. Whether all their friends, for example, overuse or abuse alcohol or drugs. We ask them whether they've ever tried to stop and what they did to stop and what they felt about failing because, of course, their efforts to stop had not produced what they'd wanted. We often use a motivational scale to see how motivated they are to take recovery actions. And this scale is a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being I'm really not motivated at all, and 10 being I'm the most motivated I've ever been about anything I've ever done. And when the client gives a number, let's say it's number 5, rather than asking why it's not 10, which would be the obvious question, I suppose, we instead go the other way. We say, well, why is it 5 and not 3? Why is it more? Why is it more than 3? And the client will then explain all the reasons why it's 5 and not 3. And that helps the client, by vocalizing it, become more motivated. They realize there's a good reason why they're trying. So we do this reverse examination, if you like. We often ask clients about their story and their narrative, but they may not actually want to talk about it. They may not be very honest in talking about it. We talk about what the recovery actions involve, and the client may not be interested in those recovery actions. So in those cases, we give the client as much information as the client is willing to receive. And we hope that having received that information, they'll think about it and they'll come back. There are many addiction treatment interventions that are possible. The one most well studied and the one that seems to be most effective in treatment are really a combination of cognitive, behavioral and medical interventions. The most well-known intervention is cognitive behavioral therapy. And cognitive behavioral therapy has many offshoots. For example, dialectical behavioral therapy, motivational interviewing, and acceptance and commitment therapy. So these therapies are also combined with mindfulness and meditation, which is a crucial part of the recovery process. So the medical treatment is quite often necessary for someone who is severely suffering acute or chronic mental illnesses, such as depression, major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, ADHD, and so on. And really the studies have shown that the combination of therapy and medical interventions are the most effective. Clients really respond well to a structured recovery approach where there is a clear schedule of actions, and these actions develop over time. One action, once successfully completed, then is the foundation to build on the next action and the next phase of recovery. So this sort of tiered step phases of recovery interventions is the most effective. This tiered phase of recovery actions is quite an important part. There are tools that are used to increase distress tolerance and to help regulate and manage emotions. The starting point of all recovery work is really that the client is able to admit to themselves and to others that they are powerless over their behavior and that their lives have become unmanageable. After that, then the clients are ready to learn some short-term tools to identify and to manage triggers which lead to urges and cravings. And I think the most effective, but the most difficult tool for clients to pick up early on in recovery is really the attending or attendance at meetings of peers who are also in recovery. Alcoholics Anonymous, for example, Narcotics Anonymous, Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous, and Smart Recovery are all groups of people who are not practitioners, but they are working their recovery through a structured program called the 12 Steps. And so the trouble is that most people who are suffering addictions in the early stages are so full of shame that they don't want to go to a meeting of strangers. They don't want to be sharing their innermost pain, their innermost shame. And so they're reluctant to attend. But once they do attend, they find a fellowship of like-minded people who are willing to support them. Some of them are in good recovery and in long-term recovery and can teach them and help them along the way. So it's that fellowship that really supports them throughout this recovery process and gives them an opportunity to give back once they've achieved a certain amount of recovery. So the relapse prevention plan is really one of the central pillars of early recovery. The purpose is for the client to be able to understand what actually triggers their urges and cravings. This may be people, places, circumstances, objects. It may be moods. It may be all kinds of triggers, and the triggers can be quite subtle. The clients learn that these triggers may have started early on, even before the obvious triggers come to them. And so they can do an analysis and see how one thing leads to another thing and leads to urges, cravings, and then acting out or alcohol use or drug use. This gives clients tremendous insight into their addiction. The second part of the relapse prevention plan is really to create an action plan around what to do. So if a trigger arises, I'm aware of it, now what do I do? And those plans are varied, but there are a great many things that clients can do when they feel a trigger, when they're aware of a trigger, in order to reduce the urge and craving so they don't go to the behavior that's causing them so many problems. Really, the relapse prevention plan is the early roadmap for recovery. The triggers, as I mentioned, are very personal, so they're very varied. Someone might be triggered by walking past a bar, for example. Someone might be triggered by just looking at some tin foil. Some people might be triggered if something bad happens at work, or something bad happens at home, or something good happens at work, or good happens at home. So they could be triggered by things that are terrible. They might be triggered by things that are great. They may be triggered by places, locations. They may be walking down a particular street or a particular area, and it triggers a memory. All triggers really relate to what's going on in the brain. And what's going on in the brain is that the brain itself is looking for some kind of trigger. It actually searches for those triggers in order to do the behavior, because the brain has learned that behavior creates some sort of pleasure or relief. So triggers really are a function of the brain and dopamine, and dopamine is a neurochemical, and so really the triggers could be someone opening a laptop or closing a laptop. It could be hearing ice tinkling in a glass in a movie or a Netflix episode. So they're really quite varied. So these tools to use when a trigger arises are the tools that we discuss in therapy, and there are many, many of them, and it depends on the person as to which tool they pick up, which tool seems helpful to them. and which tool they've experimented with and it's worked for them. Some tools relate to changing my thoughts. So if thoughts arise, and these thoughts are triggers, then I become aware of those thoughts and I change them into more helpful thoughts. Some of these are simply avoidance. I don't go to those areas. I don't look at those websites, and so on. Some of the tools are really managing my emotions, because my emotions are the things that triggered me. And how do I manage fear? How do I manage shame? How do I manage anger and rage and irritation? Some of the tools are calling people, talking to people, and that's where the 12-step programs are really quite helpful, because there are people I can talk to, describe what happened, and those people will be able to empathize and say, yeah, that happened to me. And this is what I did when that happened to me. And in therapy, we narrow them down to things that will work for that individual. The appropriate level of care is generally fairly obvious. But the difficulty is always whether the client's willing to accept that level of care. So for example, if we start at the top, the most thorough level of care is really inpatient treatment, meaning that the client stays for 3 to 8 weeks in a rehabilitation facility. And that level of care is necessary for people who are suffering from very chronic, for example, chronic health conditions and need to go through a detox regimen under medical supervision. It's also suitable for people who simply cannot control their behavior and it's causing a lot of risk and perhaps a lot of damage. Those facilities are very helpful if people are on their own and they don't really have a support network. And for people who perhaps have no idea about what recovery involves and are fairly resistant to making change. So those facilities are very helpful. The second level, the one below that, is intensive outpatient treatment. And that really means that the client comes several days a week, usually 3 days a week, spends a couple of hours or perhaps 3 hours during that period each time, and does that for a period of 6 weeks or so. So that is quite helpful for people who, for example, are working and they can't just spend 6 weeks away, or they have family responsibilities and they can't just leave them. The third level is really individual therapy, couples therapy, family therapy, that might be done on a weekly basis initially, and then is spaced out over longer periods of time. If someone goes for inpatient treatment, that once they are released from inpatient treatment, they will go to regular therapy, individual therapy, couples therapy, family therapy, and that they will go to a recovery group, whether it be Smart Recovery or one of the 12-step groups. And that they will continue working on the various tools that they learned in the inpatient treatment. Similarly, if they are in outpatient intensive care, we hope that after intensive outpatient treatment, they will go and continue to do individual therapy. Perhaps they do group therapy and family therapy and couples therapy, and continue in their recovery room. The truth is that many clients go into inpatient recovery, come out and have no success in controlling their behavior because they decided not to do anything else. They think that it's a one-shot problem with a one-shot solution. And unfortunately that isn't the case, and they may go back to inpatient treatment many times. They may go from intensive outpatient treatment into inpatient treatment, and so on. So there's movements back and forth between these modalities depending on the client's ability to remain in recovery and learn from the tools and practice the tools. The first phase is really just stopping the behavior, and so that phase is the focus of attention, and the client may spend quite a bit of time in therapy working on just that, just stopping the behavior. But ultimately, recovery is the second phase, which is substituting that behavior for something equally satisfying, more meaningful, more purposeful, more healthy. And that means changing lifestyle, and sometimes changing friends, and sometimes job, and sometimes even family members. So that change is a gradual one over time. And really, someone in recovery doesn't need to stay out of recovery. It doesn't need to finish recovery. We hope that they will stay in recovery for the rest of their lives. And it's not a sentence, because what it means is that they live these healthy, meaningful, purposeful lives with healthy, intimate relationships going forward. So everyone should be doing that. So they simply have an opportunity to do what everybody else should be doing, which is having a healthy, meaningful, purposeful life, a full life. The difference is that people with addictions are blessed because they're blessed with the motivation to stay the course and to continue with work-life balance and so forth. Involving family members as early as possible is actually quite important, because the success rates of people in treatment for addictions increases dramatically if they have family members supporting them, and supporting them in the right way. So sometimes the family members come for the first session, and that's quite helpful, because the family members can give a fairly detailed and objective narrative as to what's happened and what it's like now. And that's helpful because the person with the addiction may not be yet willing to give all the details or any of the details. The other thing is that I get to see how much distress the family members are in. And that helps me, but it also helps the client, because the client is faced with their distress, faced with their honest narrative. And that can be quite motivating for the client. The third thing is that during that session I get to talk about what an addiction is. And that's helpful for the family, but it's also helpful for the client, and also what recovery is and what that involves. Again, that's helpful for the family, but it's also helpful for the client, because they may not have otherwise been willing to hear what recovery involves. Finally, it gives me an opportunity to talk to the loved ones about how they can help, what they can do that will be helpful, and what they are doing that is not helpful. And both the person who's suffering from that compulsive behavior and to their loved ones, there is hope. There is a solution. And whilst they may be in despair, and they may be angry, they may be frustrated, they may be depressed and anxious, the starting point for both the person with the addiction and also the family members is to learn about it. And there is so much on the internet nowadays that teaches people what is this addiction, what is recovery. And there's so many narratives, hope narratives, people who have been through the recovery process, who are online speaking about it. And the more they learn, the more they understand. So I think learning is really the first step. And then contacting someone who is a therapist who specializes in addictions. The difficulty of approaching a therapist who does not specialize in addictions is that they're not likely to get the level of care that's needed. And the level of care for someone with an addiction needs to be quite high. There needs to be quite a bit of expertise and experience on addictions treatment for that client to thrive. Similarly, the loved ones ought to get therapy as well. And the therapists who specialize with loved ones is important, because again, this is a very specialist area with specialist training and experience.